A gunshot rang out, and someone fell to the ground. The captured Alliance members crouched in the corner, their heads in their hands. They were stunned to see the Stellar Technology soldiers kill someone at the first sign of disagreement. They wondered how they had been tricked so easily into siding with these ruthless monsters. How had they so quickly bought into Stellar Technology's lies? One of the officers holstered his pistol. "You have to know one thing," he said sternly. "Your lives are in our hands now. If we want you to live, you live. If we want you to die, you die. No negotiations. I'll kill anyone who dares to get up." The Alliance members cowered even lower, not daring to move from their positions. Outside, the Stellar Technology soldiers continued to give their demands to the remaining Dawn Alliance members who opposed them in battle. "Listen up, all of you," blared a voice over the loudspeaker. "You have 10 minutes to surrender before we raze this place to the ground." A cannon boomed, tearing a large hole through the wall of one of the residential blocks. "You see that?" the voice called out. "That's what happens if you don't do as we say." This show of destruction was much more powerful than any words of persuasion would have been. Following the cannon fire, around 100 people fled the building and rushed to the soldiers, kneeling at their feet and crying out, "Spare me! We surrender! We surrender!" The soldiers weren't surprised in the least. In their eyes, anyone who didn't surrender simply didn't understand the gravity of the situation. They went around collecting the surrendered Alliance soldiers' weapons, and they prepared to escort them to the underground parking lot where they held the others captive. One of the soldiers shook his head. "So this is all the backbone these people can muster? Pathetic." Some of the people who had run out of the building recognized this man, who had been one of them before he had joined Stellar Technology years ago. "You!" shouted one of them. "You're actually working for these monsters?" "Yeah," shouted another. "Nothing but a lackey for your new overlords." These weren't brave people by nature. They didn't care much about who they followed, as long as they were protected. They had first chosen to join the Dawn Alliance because at the time, the Dawn Alliance had been the most powerful party. But now, faced with these armed soldiers, it had been natural to switch sides. Even groveling in surrender wasn't beneath them if it meant they would be safe. Other people had done much worse in the name of personal safety. But when they recognized this man who had once been a neighbor, who was now aiming a rifle at them, they were enraged. They hadn't previously thought of themselves as proud of where they had come from, but to see one of their own number so blatantly wearing the uniform of these monsters was too much. Their fury boiled over, and they had only one thought. "Kill the traitor!" one of them yelled. "Yeah, get him!" A dozen of them lifted their blades into the air and charged at the soldiers, catching them off guard and wounding several of them. But then a machine gun fired out, and all those who had run at the man were shot down. Even some who hadn't resisted were caught in the gunfire and fell to the ground. The others dropped to their knees again in surrender, cast their weapons aside, and begged for mercy. "We didn't do anything! We're innocent! We surrender! Don't kill us, please!" One of the soldiers spat on the ground. "What cowards," he said. He ordered a group to bring people to the underground parking lot. After hearing the commotion outside, some of the people still in the building clenched their blades and hid in a corner, ready to attack the enemy as soon as they came through the doors. But there were just as many who were impatient to rush out. They threw away their weapons, shouting, "We surrender!" Over the next short while, the soldiers fired on the building with machine guns and cannons, forcing even more people to submit. In this time, roughly 1,000 people gave in, pouring out of the building with their hands up, and they were taken away to the underground parking lot too. Next, the soldiers filed into the building to take care of anyone left behind. The inside of the building was soon a chaos of screams, gunfire, and the clash of steel. "Cut them down!" the defenders cried out. "Attack the soldiers and these traitors who've joined them!" Some of the people hiding in the corner charged at the new arrivals, waving their machetes and fighting almost in a frenzy. They were no longer even fighting to survive, but to take down as many of the enemies as they could. But they were no match for the soldiers. While the defenders had knives and machetes, the soldiers had state-of-the-art rifles and armor. In the face of such a powerful force, of course, there were many others who surrendered and begged for mercy. They hoped that luck would be on their side and that they would be spared. In the end, the Stellar Technology soldiers retreated from the building. They had been successful in forcing many of the Alliance forces inside to surrender. Still, one of the soldiers said to his superior, "It's late at night. We can hardly see anything in there, and we lost a lot of troops. I request permission for our troops to return in daylight to continue our attack." The commander surveyed the remaining soldiers and nodded. "Granted," he said. "Besides, we've already taken control of this place. Surround the building and put pressure on them. They'll run out of supplies soon enough. I don't expect they'll put up much of a fight when they've run out completely." He ordered more than a dozen paranormals and over 500 fully armed troops to surround the 4 districts that had fallen to them. Then he prepared for the next step. Their goal wasn't to kill these people, but to capture them for biochemical experiments. If they played the waiting game, he was sure that it would only be a matter of time before the remainder of the people surrendered on their own. And he was correct. After the 4 teams had taken up their positions in the 4 districts, many of the people trapped inside could no longer endure the torture of waiting and came out with their hands up before being led to the underground parking lot. From there, another commander took them to the district where the other members of the Dawn Alliance were waiting. When the Stellar Technology soldiers arrived at the area defended by the Dawn Alliance, they found themselves blocked by a barrier of glowing energy shields. "What is this?" asked one of the soldiers. "We can't get through," said another. They tried to pierce the shields with machine gun fire, but their bullets only created ripples on the surface and didn't break through. Some of the paranormals in the group shook their heads in confusion. "Creating an energy shield is a skill only 5th level paranormals can use," she said. "Could there really be one inside?" They hadn't yet heard that one of their teams had already faced defeat, so they had no idea that there might be such a powerful paranormal in the Dawn Alliance. And they weren't wrong. Charles wasn't technically at the 5th level yet. Still, his powers were so great that he might as well have been. The commander frowned, assessing the situation. "Even if there's a 5th level expert inside," he said to a middle-aged officer at his side, "creating so many energy shields is bound to drain their own energies. Even if they're replenishing themselves with medicinal crystal cores, they'll soon run out if they haven't already, don't you think?" "That's right," the officer said. "Then we'll be able to use the cannons to bombard them." "We need to be careful," said the commander. "Although we have plenty of guns and bullets, we have limited ammunition for the cannons. Rather than wasting it here, we should wait for reinforcements to arrive." "So what?" snarled the officer. "Are we just going to do nothing here in the meantime? If we sit around and wait for the reinforcements to arrive, they'll take all the credit. I'll be damned if I'll let that happen." "All right," said the commander. "We need some troops to launch an initial attack anyway to figure out what we're up against here. I'm putting you in charge of that." "Give me 3 teams," said the officer, nodding. "I'll go and scope out the situation." The commander was surprised by how eagerly the officer took to the task. He had called it an initial attack, but really these people were being led into the firing line as cannon fodder. He hadn't expected the officer to be so keen to comply. "When you've gathered your troops," he said, "make sure you've arranged cannon support and cover, and then go and test the enemy's strength." The officer led nearly 500 soldiers from the 3 teams into the charge. "Listen up," he called out to the troops. "Don't waste any bullets. Anyone who makes it through this alive will be given superpowers. You'll have more strength than you ever dreamed of." Excitement rippled through the ranks. With this promise to be turned into paranormals, they prepared to charge under the cover of cannon fire without a care for anything else. "No reckless movements," cried the officer. "Use the bunker as cover. We're going to wait for the enemy to come to us before we fight." On the other side of the energy shield, Kevin could make out the fury and aggression on the faces of the enemy soldiers. He wasn't worried at all, giving his own orders in a calm and measured tone. They had set up the defenses in advance. Some were trenches that the military had dug ahead of time, some giant rocks put in place by Earth-powered paranormals, and others simple sandbags. At this point, the Neal family was split in 2. There were those who followed the members who had taken power, and the others who refused to follow them. In Kevin's eyes, the latter group was the true Neal family. Those who had pledged loyalty to Kevin, including the death squads he had trained, all listened to his orders now. In addition, he also had the support of Charles and the military, which allowed them to make long-range attacks either with paranormal abilities or artillery fire. His leadership skills meant that although he had relatively few people on his side, their loyalty and determination weren't to be doubted. When the officer saw no sign of the enemy under Stellar Technology's barrage of cover fire, he shouted, "They're terrified! All troops move forward! We have to gain more ground!" His 3 teams advanced, but when they entered the enemy territory, a large number of Alliance members leapt out from behind their defenses. The ambush didn't surprise the Stellar Technology soldiers. It delighted them. They had more than 40 paranormals in this 500-strong unit, which they were confident would be more than a match for the Alliance. And when they saw the enemy soldiers holding nothing more than knives, their spirits lifted even higher. If they were holding weapons, it meant that they weren't paranormals, and so the Stellar Technology soldiers thought the battle would be child's play. At the moment the two sides finally clashed, though, things took a turn. A fireball cast by one of the paranormals didn't ignite its target the way it should have done. Instead, it was cut in two by the enemy's blade. The paranormal's brain went blank just before the enemy's blade took his life. It was a scene that was repeated across the battlefield, with the paranormals using their abilities with confidence before finding they were blocked by the defenders' soul energy. Some even turned and ran off. "They aren't afraid of our powers!" one of them cried out. "Our powers are useless against them! We're no match for them! Run!" The stronger the paranormal, the more startled they were to find their powers so useless. And when the paranormals broke file and retreated, the rest of the troops followed. The officer watched with fury. "Those who run will be killed!" he called out, waving his longsword in his hand and lunging at any defectors that passed his way. He couldn't believe his eyes. Do these people have no guts at all? He wondered. Whatever happened to showing bravery in the face of danger? In his view, a battle should be a confrontation between two armies, each relying on their strength, equipment, tactics, and formations to decide which would prevail. But this battle was different, with such an obvious disparity between the two sides. It meant that once his troops had tasted even the slightest fear, it had spread like a landslide. He hadn't spent long reflecting on this catastrophic defeat before an energy spell in the form of a dragon, conjured by a member of the Alliance, flew over the retreating troops and snatched them in its jaws. And with the death of their commander, the remainder of the Stellar Technology teams crumbled completely and ran for safety. A Stellar Technology officer knocked one of the soldiers who had fled the battle to the ground. "You really think I'll believe that the enemy can just ignore our paranormals as attacks?" he asked. "Nonsense. Just be honest and own up to the fact that you lost to them. Not because they're too strong, but because you're too timid. Weren't you trained to fight until the end?" Nearly 500 soldiers had attacked the Alliance. Of these, 200 had retreated to safety. To the officer, this was a shameful number. Some other Stellar Technology members looked at the retreaters with disdain. "These guys are pathetic," one of them muttered. "You can't trust them to do anything right." The commander's jaw was set, and his gaze was cold and hard. "It doesn't matter," he said. "We sent these troops out to see what we're up against, and now we know. If we can't attack from this direction, we'll simply try another." "Who should we send?" asked the officer. The commander glared at the deserters arranged before him. "Your cowardice has shamed the Stellar Technology Army," he said. "According to company rules, deserters must be sentenced to death. But I'll give you one chance to save yourself and atone for your crimes. I'm sending you back to the battlefield." The soldiers, who had only just managed to escape the battle alive, began to protest. "We can't do it!" one cried out. "There are ambushes everywhere! We're no match for them at all. Please spare us!" They hadn't been regular soldiers to begin with. Stellar Technology had simply picked out some of the taller survivors they had captured and had given them weapons and armor. At first, these soldiers had thought they would enjoy a good life under Stellar Technology's protection. What they had found instead was hell. The commander turned to the officer and said, "Kill anyone who resists." And with that order, a third of the soldiers begging for their lives were shot down. Together with one of the other teams, the remaining troops attacked another entrance to the Alliance's headquarters. This time, they chose the area patrolled by the army on the side of the Alliance, but they were quickly beaten back. "Their firepower is strongest here," one of the officers said. "Should we choose a different route or wait here until daylight before attacking further?" "No point in trying a different route, sir," the soldier replied. "The other one we could try is left undefended. I'm sure that's a trap. Who knows what they're using to defend that entrance?" The commander frowned. "Go to the parking lot and bring some people over," he said. "We'll use them as human shields and get in that way." "Well, don't dawdle." He turned to the paranormals. "Attack their energy shields. We'll be able to get in once their energy is exhausted." "Yes, sir," came the answer. A team of soldiers headed to the underground parking lot, preparing to take some of their captives on this new mission. They walked past the armed guards at the entrance to find more than 1,000 people inside, some squatting, others sitting on the ground. A few of the paranormals already in the room laughed at the sight of these helpless people cowering in fear, and they approached them. The captives looked up at them. One of the paranormals bent down and took hold of a woman's chin. "You're real pretty," he said, and he grabbed her arm. The woman spat at him. "Let go of me, you beast." She tried her best to struggle against the man, but she was a human struggling against a superhuman. Her cries for help only seemed to make the paranormal more determined. "Save me," she cried, turning to her husband, who was squatting on the ground and trembling. "You're her husband, huh?" said the paranormal. "No, I'm not," the man stuttered, so scared that he couldn't even meet the paranormal's gaze. "I have nothing to do with her." "That's what I thought," said the paranormal, and he pulled the woman away. As she was taken off, the woman kept her eyes locked on her husband's, her heart an abyss. The man didn't dare to close his eyes. He could only watch, humiliated and terrified, as they took her out of sight. Meanwhile, other paranormals elsewhere tore other women away and led them off as their families looked on helplessly, trying desperately not to think of what hell these demons had in mind for them. They were hardly even noticed by the new soldiers who went through the crowd, searching for the best candidates for the mission. "We're here for human shields," said one of them, "under orders of the commander." Two hours later, Charles, who had recovered about half of his strength, came out of seclusion to assess the situation. Since he had reached the 4th level, although the speed at which he absorbed energy was much faster, it took a longer time to fully store it. Even if he continuously refined medicinal crystal cores and the corpses of those he had killed, there was still a limit to the amount of energy he could recover. Still, this was enough for him. Running on only half the total amount of 4th level energy still amounted to more than twice the power of 3rd level energy. The difference in quality was night and day. He wouldn't have needed to use so much energy if it wasn't for the construction of the energy shields. "The battle hasn't reached its climax yet," said Olivia. "It's like they're waiting for something." Charles felt uneasy. "Reinforcements, maybe? Why the lull in fighting?" "It might be that they're trying to lure us out," she said. "My spies in the other districts have said that a lot of people have surrendered to the enemy. Even now, they're going around searching for more people to take to their side." "How many haven't surrendered?" he asked. "A total of 14,000 people joined the Dawn Alliance," she replied. "If my intel is correct, about 3,000 have surrendered, while the rest are still hiding in the residential buildings. I'd say there's at least 7,000 or 8,000 of them." "I see," he said. "They want to capture them alive for their experiments. That's their priority." "Right now we're stuck in defense," she explained. "The longer we're hiding behind the energy shield, the more uneasy people will get. They might try to escape." "The Alliance might be young, but at least we've stuck through this together. Even if we lose half of them, it doesn't matter." Charles said this in such an indifferent tone that Olivia felt helpless. Of course, she didn't really believe that he was as disinterested in the survival of the people as he sounded. Otherwise, why would he have stayed with them? Why would he have expanded the recruitment for the Dawn Alliance? But it was clear that he was able to remove emotion from a situation so that he could see it more clearly before deciding on the next move. "I'm going out for a while," he said. "Wait here." He walked away. As he was the one who had built the energy shield, he was able to pass through it without an issue. He chose a direction where there were the fewest guards, and he crossed through the barrier. Since he was wearing an amulet that ensured he didn't even need to breathe, he was able to pass among the people outside without them being aware of his presence. 10 minutes later, he returned, looking gloomy. "Has something happened?" asked Olivia. He nodded. "Get ready to fight. The enemy will feint at 3 of our gates and throw their main forces at the southern one. We need to replace all military personnel with Alliance members, and we need to do it fast." Although Olivia didn't understand, she trusted Charles enough to follow his orders. When the military learned it was to be replaced by members of the Alliance, they kicked up a fuss. Greg approached Charles. "I know I'm not one of you," he said, "but my soldiers and I are helping you fight this war. Although we only have 100 people, with our experience and our equipment, we're worth 1,000 of you. In fact, in situations like this, the more people you have on your side, the greater the chances of things going wrong. Disagreements break out, orders get lost, and before you know it, 10 soldiers aren't fighting with the strength of 10, but with 5. But if you have a small team, as long as they're properly trained, you can do the job of thousands. I'm not doubting your ability to fight, said Charles. I just need your help with something else. While we're tackling the enemy head-on, I want you to circle around and ambush them from behind. Greg blushed and stuttered. He said. I'm sorry. I misunderstood you. A cold silence followed before Charles said, You shouldn't have started blaming me before hearing my reasons. Perhaps the stress of the situation is getting the better of you. Greg looked at the ground and shook his head. No, sir. I'm sorry. Charles sighed to see the soldier so crestfallen. He understood something now that he hadn't before. Even though he had killed the Hive Queen and had stopped the bug horde, the world hadn't become any less dangerous. And the task of protecting against this danger fell, for the most part, on the military. He had lost sight of the fact that soldiers were people too. Behind their guns and their uniforms, and their duty to protect the people, they too were living individuals with their own hopes and fears. Greg took a deep breath and said, We'll try our best. We were in a similar situation at the survival base. We were keeping over 100,000 people safe in there, but a rebellion broke out. The people outside wanted to be let in, but the people inside wanted to keep the place for themselves. In the end, a fight broke out. Charles was shocked. Did you try to stop the dispute? We had over 3,000 soldiers trying to maintain order. After the mob turned on us, fewer than 400 of us survived. Charles's heart felt even heavier. Although he had changed many things for the better, there was still much left to do. He had learned some things about the Army's situation from Miranda, but not the whole story. He couldn't believe that the Army had given food and weapons to the survivors in the survival base, only for those receiving protection to turn on their protectors. Charles came close to revealing how much Greg's story had affected him, but stopped himself at the last moment. Regardless of their cooperation with the Dawn Alliance, the military still had to solve their own problems by themselves. In managing others, you need to use the stick as well as the carrot, he thought. And if you threaten them with the stick often enough, deciding to threaten them a little less and incentivize them a little more, sometimes is all you need to win their gratitude. He silently reflected on how the Alliance had grown so much. How did I get the support of so many people? It wasn't just because I saved everyone's lives, or showed them how powerful I was. These things helped, sure, but most important was the Swarm's attack. It was only after the people saw what we were really up against that they finally took my side. For the military to be seen as a serious deterrence, it would need to show how utterly ruthless it could be. This is the main reason Charles didn't want to join it. He didn't want to become that type of person. I don't want to interfere in the private matters of the military, he said to Greg. But if you really want to grow, something needs to change. I want to get this message to the higher-ups in the military. Whether or not you listen is your business. Greg leaned in. What is it? Should you save 1,000 people, or kill 1,000 to save 10,000? Charles asked. This question is the biggest test of human nature. I won't say which answer I think is correct. I'll admit that some of you are even better at making decisions than I am. But the Army is the greatest hope of protecting this land. I hope that when you face a problem like this, you'll make the right choice. He turned to the others. You need to understand that this disaster isn't ending anytime soon. I hope that when you consider saving people, you don't think of the number of people, but of which of the people you save will still be alive in a year's time, or 2 years, or 10 years, long enough to have children and raise a new generation. Everyone was shocked. Was Charles really saying this? After thinking over his words a little, though, they began to come around to his point of view. If their struggle wasn't only for their own survival, but that of humanity itself, it was crucial that they used reason and not emotion to make certain decisions. Killing 1,000 people seemed very cruel, but sometimes difficult decisions like these had to be made. Think about this, Charles continued. Imagine the choice was between saving 10,000 people who were destined to die a year later, or 1,000 who might live for 10 years and have their own children. Which would you choose? The crowd's first objection was that they couldn't possibly tell which people might only live another year and which would survive longer. When they thought about it, though, they realized that they had actually known all along but had been unwilling to face the truth. Those with enough determination and experience to survive stood out from the rest, while those who couldn't tough it out would only bring the others down. Greg said, "I'll be sure to relay this to my superior." He now understood why Charles had chosen the specific people who made up the Dawn Alliance. They were those people who he knew would survive the longest. He didn't give even a second thought to anyone who would clearly be dead soon. "All right," said Charles, checking his watch. "They'll be attacking soon. We've got to move. Let's get ready." When Charles had left the fortress earlier, it had been to assess the situation at the district's southern gate, one of the entrances to the energy shield. He estimated that this was where Stellar Technology would launch their largest attack, while any attempts on the other gates would be merely distractions. Olivia and the other Alliance members had blind trust in Charles's judgment, and sure enough, not long after they had assembled at the gate, a crowd of blurry figures appeared in the distance. When they first caught sight of the enemy, excitement rippled through the Alliance. It wasn't that they were hungry for battle, but that the enemy's arrival had proved Charles correct, and it gave them hope that the rest of his plan would succeed. Now that they had the confidence that things would go their way, they were itching to fight. They were sure that the previous battle had honed their skills, and were keen to test out their new strength. "Turn on the lights," called out Olivia, and the bright headlights of more than 10 cars filled the approach to the gate with a dazzling white glare. Anyone trying to breach the gate would have to make their way past this blinding sea of light. With the headlights switched on, members of the crowd tightened their grip on the long blades and daggers in their hands. The first troops in the enemy army entered the gate formed by the energy shield. "Kill them," Olivia cried. At this order, many paranormals prepared their superpowers, while a crowd of regular soldiers prepared to ambush. When the enemy got closer and the Alliance members could finally see exactly who was approaching them, they stalled in shock. The first line of the approaching army was a group of unarmed people in ragged clothes, their hands raised. "We're also from the Dawn Alliance," a man in the group shouted. "Please don't kill us," a woman pleaded. Compared to the fully armed soldiers behind them, it was easy to tell that these people truly were members of the Dawn Alliance. Watching them approach, Olivia's mind went blank for a moment, but she quickly rallied, and she shouted, "You at the front, listen up. Come no further and do your best to get out of the way. Otherwise, don't blame us if you get caught in the crossfire." Clearly, these people were being used as human shields by the soldiers. If the Alliance let them come any closer, it would be equivalent to welcoming their enemies into their base. Some of the people ducked down, but others shouted back at Olivia, "You're shameless! We're all members of the Alliance, aren't we? So why don't you let us in?" "That's right, we're all members of the Alliance. We have to help each other." "They won't let us in. They want us to die out here. What should we do?" There was a moment of deadly silence before one of them cried out, "Charge in and kill them!" Soon the others took up the call. And so these people, who just minutes before had begged for mercy, charged at the gate without a thought for the consequences. Olivia narrowed her eyes at the approaching army. Dawn Alliance or not, they were now undoubtedly the enemy. She turned to the soldiers and shouted one word: "Attack." Olivia knew that she had to put her emotions aside to give the necessary order. If she hesitated, even for a moment, it would undermine what needed to be done, and she had to show strength in front of her followers. "Attack the enemy," she cried. "Don't worry if you hit anyone in the way." However, when she gave the order, none of her subordinates complied. "They're on the same side as us," someone said. "We're not going to kill our own people," another agreed. "They aren't even armed." The soldiers had good hearts, and they were unwilling to risk casualties from their own side. They were eager to kill the enemy, but not to the detriment of their own allies. Rather than harm innocent people, several of the soldiers lowered their weapons altogether and told the unarmed ones to make their way behind the army out of harm's way. Unfortunately, although the sentiment was noble, the incoming wave of people then fought their way through the Dawn Alliance soldiers and ruined their formation. The soldiers were jostled around by panicked people trying to get out of the line of fire. Many of the soldiers didn't know what to do. They couldn't even hold their weapons straight for fear of accidentally hitting the people running toward them. The soldiers shouted as the people pushed through the crowd, "Go around us! Don't push me! Are you all idiots?" If the people had passed through in an orderly manner, it wouldn't have been an issue. However, because they were panicked, They all surged forward at once and created an immediate hindrance. They all wanted to be the first to reach safety. Several of the soldiers found themselves trampled by the fleeing crowd, and a few even died as a result. Olivia was distraught and enraged. Why didn't they just listen to the order? She thought furiously. As soon as those idiots were between us and our targets, they weren't our allies anymore. But it was too late to rectify the damage. When the Stellar Technology Army saw that the large number of people had made it through the gate, they took the opportunity to rush through after them. Dozens of machine guns opened fire at the same time, and a number of the enemy paranormals sent fire spewing toward the Alliance forces. The Alliance members on the front line, along with the civilians who were rushing through the exit, were quickly shot down by heavy machine guns. They fell in rows like dominoes. The survivors who were still trying to get in and hide behind the army cried out as they were shot down. "You lied to us! You said we could come in!" Despite the fact that the Alliance had done its best to let them in, the civilians seemed unable to acknowledge that their own folly had led to them becoming casualties of war. Many of them went to their deaths feeling as though they had been betrayed. Olivia was incensed by the way the battle was going. The number of people along the front line that had been lost was around 600. It was true that it was a small number compared to the total number of people in the Dawn Alliance, but to her, war wasn't a number. She lamented the fact that she was down 600 fighters for the sake of what she considered to be a bunch of sanctimonious cowards. On the roof of a nearby building, Harper fixed Zack with a sad expression. She heaved a sigh of disappointment. "I told you we shouldn't have saved them," she said. "We paid the price of our own soldiers to save a few people who aren't even fighting for us. This is why we need to be more discerning. We have to be prepared to lose some people for the sake of the others." Zack's face was full of pain and guilt. When the people from outside had ruined the army's formation, Harper had told him to take some of them out, but he had felt it wasn't right, and he had found himself unable to harm innocent people. He had thought that as long as the people obediently hid behind the Dawn Alliance, there would be nothing to worry about. But the result of his inaction was that the people seemingly ungrateful for their second chance had become pawns for the enemy that caused a large number of fatalities. "I don't want to tell you to do anything heartless," Harper assured him, "but this is war. I don't want to lose another home, which is what'll happen if we lose." The realization hit Zack like a clap of thunder. They had lost their previous home, and they had barely begun to build a new one. He wanted somewhere stable to settle down, which he admitted was naive, but he didn't think there was anything wrong with having hope. "I understand," he said quietly. Harper was conflicted. During their weeks together, she had fallen in love with Zack. If it was possible, she didn't want him to change, because she loved who he was as a person. However, she also wanted to live with him in relative safety, and in their dangerous world, it was already hard enough to find a place that could shelter the two of them. Zack would need to prove that he could help her protect what they had. In her mind, he didn't lack strength, but he did lack conviction. Dragon energy descend. Brilliant flames erupted around Zack's body. They disappeared quickly, but were quickly replaced by the appearance of a fire dragon. True fire, elemental dragon, level 5. Harper was shocked. She had only meant for Zack to become a little more decisive. She had expected him to break through to level 5 just to defend her. "You're right," Zack told her. "Those people might have been innocent, but they brought destruction on our army. It's not enough to be kind. I have to be able to protect my home." The fire dragon launched itself into the enemy's formation. Zack shouted at the invading army, "Those who threaten our home will be killed without mercy." When Zack's fire dragon appeared, the Stellar Technology soldiers who had charged through the Alliance's gates feared for their lives. "They have a level 5 paranormal!" one soldier cried. They themselves had used their own level 5 paranormal on their front line to increase the army's confidence and raise morale. Despite only being one level higher than some of their best fighters, the psychological difference was enough to leave a deep sense of security in their hearts. They hadn't realized that the Alliance had their own level 5 fighter, and many of them wondered how one had suddenly appeared seemingly from thin air. The Stellar Technology soldiers cried out in fear and ran back through the gate, shoving each other aside to try to escape as quickly as possible. The fiery dragon wreaked havoc among the group, taking one life after another with ease. 3 enemy paranormals died on the spot. The number of lives the dragon took was secondary to the amount of chaos it created. Its presence alone was enough to deter many enemy soldiers. Wherever the dragon went, it was accompanied by a stampede of fleeing people. The Stellar Technology Army staggered around in fear, and its leaders began to order their subordinates. "Kill the level 5! Paranormal Masters, get in there and do something!" Although the Paranormals knew that they didn't stand a chance against a level 5 warrior, they knew that they didn't have much choice. A few of them began to wonder whether they could still escape, and if so, what the consequences would be. A dozen level 4 Paranormals, flanked by a fleet of soldiers, rushed toward the building where Zack was standing. "We'll kill the level 5 Paranormal. You guys deal with the others," one Paranormal told their squadron. They didn't believe that a level 5 expert would be unguarded, so they decided to bring some other soldiers along to take care of any pesky guards the Paranormal may have around him. Because their location and tactics were already conspicuous, they didn't bother to attempt a sneak attack like their comrades had done against Charles. Instead, they openly ran into battle. They soon saw that the reality was as they had expected. Zack was attacking from the roof of the building, while a large number of Dawn Alliance members waited below to fight anyone who tried to approach. Earthwall technique. The Alliance's Paranormals created a wall of earth that blocked the Stellar Technology forces from being able to enter the building. It blocked both their path and their bullets. Their weapons may have been top of the line and able to shoot a person from a significant distance, but they were no match for a barricade. However, the enemy wasn't only equipped with guns. They had also obtained a cultivation method from the military that allowed them to become incredibly strong, and they began to hit the barricade. Although they were lower-level Paranormals, their equipment made up for their many deficiencies. The soldiers from both sides engaged in a fierce battle, while the high-level Paranormals took advantage of the distraction and went to attack the barricade so they could enter the building. At that moment, Miranda appeared in front of them. With her sword in hand, she was an imposing figure. "Kill her," the level 4 Paranormal said. He withdrew a knife and lashed out at Miranda. Then 3 level 3 Paranormals approached her from different angles. They didn't care that they outnumbered her 4-1, and they had no intention of fighting fair. Seeing them trying to surround her, she shouted, "Moon Slash," and her sword glowed with lunar light. The level 4 Paranormal summoned a saber and gave Miranda a mocking smile. "Shall we see whose sword is better?" he asked with a laugh. He swung the large sword at her, and in his mind he had already won. Although the killing power of a saber wasn't normally much of a threat, this level 4 was a blade-type Paranormal, and the saber was designed for slashing. It was deadly from any angle, but it meant that his strikes would be more dangerous at close range than the distance techniques used by other Paranormal types. While typical sword skills could be easily deflected, the saber techniques were more powerful. The level 4 had also used a Moon Slash technique, but he knew that his saber was far superior to Miranda's smaller sword. He had considered using the Sly Stinger or Life Extinguisher technique because those were also powerful and within the capabilities of a bio-altered Paranormal, but he was less confident in his ability with those. He knew that if he used a technique that was beyond his skill level, it would not only waste his energy, but likely fail if Miranda was more skilled than him. So instead, he opted for the safer choice. When he saw that Miranda had used a lower-level technique, he assumed it was because she lacked the combat skills necessary to use a stronger attack. The moon-shaped light flashed, and the blade energy activated. The blade-type Paranormal's eyes flashed with disbelief. He stared blankly at the long blade in his hand that had been forged using Stellar Technology's special technique. Miranda's sword had easily cleaved it in two. But the Paranormal wasn't even able to wonder how Miranda had managed to best him, because his saber wasn't the only casualty of her skill. He fell to the ground dead next to his lump of useless steel. The remaining 3 Paranormals had also been in the line of fire. Every one of them had felt the lick of Miranda's sword, and they joined their fallen colleague in the dirt. Miranda raised the blood-drinking sword to her eye level and smiled at it affectionately. It had been made specially for her by Charles, and had been designed to increase in strength with every kill. She had fought several battles with it, and it was her most cherished weapon. Ever since she had used it against the Hive Queen at the military fortress, she had felt a special bond with it. She had also realized that every time the sword absorbed more energy, a portion of it was shared with her. The sword, when combined with Miranda's full power, had reached the point where even lower-level techniques had the ability to challenge people at a slightly higher level. Miranda lowered her weapon. She knew it was too early for her to celebrate victory. She returned her gaze to the battle around her and quickly pursued the group of people who had dashed away to kill Zack. Zack sent a fire dragon to cover Miranda and keep her safe from attack. The witnesses who had seen Miranda's brutal execution of multiple soldiers had been almost scared to death by the display. She killed a level 4, they thought in shock. How did she kill him so easily? One of them said what they were all thinking. Is it possible that she's a level 5 too? Those words caused many of the Stellar Technology soldiers to feel deeply uneasy. They knew that such a display of strength was only likely to come from a 5th level expert. The only chance they had against her was if a level 4 elemental paranormal worked with a level 4 bio-altered paranormal. It was, they considered, their only hope for success. While the Stellar Technology soldiers stood in a daze, Miranda entered the crowd under the cover of the fire dragon that Zack had sent her. Her swordlight flashed among the sea of soldiers, cutting down every enemy fighter in her path. While the battle raged at the gate, Charles had started to enact his own operation. He wasn't worried about any major accidents occurring at the gate. To him, as long as the number of casualties didn't exceed over a third of the Alliance's overall number of people, the battle wasn't a loss. He was aware that his views were elitist, but that was the way he had always managed to survive. His primary goal was to ensure his own survival and that of those he cared about. As he had already arranged protection for Lena, he was satisfied. Although he cared about the Alliance leaders, he would always prioritize his sister. He also reasoned that Miranda, Zack, and the others had plenty of battle experience. He didn't think any of them would come to harm, particularly with Harper around. She was immeasurably reliable and brilliant, and she knew what was expected of her as a leader. Because of her love for Zack, she was likely to ensure there were as few casualties as possible, and Charles knew he could depend on her. He knew she was a good match for Zack. Her practicality balanced him and complemented his own joyful, trusting personality. However, Charles was careful not to allow her too much control over the Alliance. He couldn't risk a coup, and he didn't want to encourage another potential leader. He and Harper didn't always see eye to eye. The military soldiers followed Charles from one side of the base to the other. However, they realized during their search that there didn't seem to be any enemies in either direction. They felt this was peculiar, since it was unlikely that Stellar Technology would fail to send anyone to guard the surrounding areas. However unlikely it seemed, though, that was indeed the case. Stellar Technology didn't have a regular army, even though they used a lot of impressive equipment. Instead, the company relied on a particular set of methods to control their subordinates, mainly bribery and threats. They offered their followers no professional training. Their commander was a professional, and he had sent a few people to investigate the perimeter. However, he knew there were many problems with the people he was charged with commanding. He found the soldiers' lack of training to be irritating at best and utterly catastrophic at worst. He found it was difficult enough to control them on the battlefield, but when he let them patrol, they were worse than useless. As a commanding officer, he couldn't understand their lack of obedience. Some of the soldiers sent to scout the area even used it as an excuse to head to the back of the army. The military commander, a man named Keenan, accompanied Charles as he scouted. There must be an ambush waiting somewhere, he remarked. They're intending to launch a full-scale attack, so why don't they have anyone guarding? There must be a trap. However, Charles led his own well-trained soldiers behind the back of the enemy's gathered forces without a hitch. Neither he nor any of the others saw a single member of the enemy on patrol to stop them. His own excellent military training made him shake his head in disbelief. He agreed with the military commander that since their plan was going smoother than expected, there was likely to be an ambush waiting for them. I think you're right, Charles said to Keenan. There could be a trap. How about I take 2 groups ahead to check it out, Keenan suggested. If there's a trap, we'll retreat immediately, and you can back us up. If the coast is clear, we'll signal for you to join us and attack. Because Charles knew that a surprise attack was possible, it was a tempting offer. Rejecting the suggestion went against everything he knew about combat, but he knew he wanted the troops in a specific position in order to create an effective attack. If they moved forward and the Stellar Technology army saw them, his plan would be ruined. Charles shook his head. I know you have considerable tactical skill, he assured Keenan, and I don't doubt your professionalism. But we're fighting in a new era, and it's changed a lot of things. If you continue to use old tactics, you'll pay for it with your life. Keenan was puzzled. What are you talking about? He asked. Charles's eyes flashed with confidence. "I don't care if they've set a trap or not," he replied. "I've calculated their numbers, and they only have about 3,000 people left. With so few people, how much damage can they actually do?" Keenan shuffled uncomfortably. He didn't consider that many people to be an insignificant number. "I know you're powerful," Keenan said, "and that you can take on 100 people single-handedly, but these people have a lot of paranormals on their side, and the number of paranormals they have is significantly more than ours." He already had some regrets about joining Charles on his escapade. He wasn't a fearful man, but he didn't understand or agree with Charles's judgment when it came to assessing military strength. He wondered if it was possible for Charles to lead them to glory without obtaining serious injuries. Charles ignored Keenan's opinion and began to give him orders. "Do you see that building?" he asked, pointing to a tall structure nearby. "Take your troops and set them up in the windows. Tell them to spread out and cover as many windows as possible. Then, leave the rest to me." Although Keenan didn't fully understand what Charles had in mind, he was a professional, and thus was obligated to follow orders. He took his group, and they went to set up the ambush. He knew that Charles intended for them to aim out of the windows and shoot the enemy from behind. It had been a common tactic in the era of firearms. The method wasn't reliant on the size of the firearms, but on the location of the shooters. The enemy wouldn't know which window the shots were coming from, and therefore it gave the Alliance the element of surprise. But that required them to have access to an unguarded building, and Keenan was certain the enemy would have many people stationed in the building to prevent the Alliance from doing exactly what they were planning. If the enemy knew they were there, it seemed the plan had failed before it began. It didn't seem like a good tactic. He also had to consider how to take out the enemy guards without alerting the waiting army below. But as his mind raced over all the potential dangers, Charles's words echoed through his head. "If you continue to use old tactics, you'll pay for it with your life." Despite his reservations, he had an inexplicable confidence in Charles. Maybe he has a way to lure the enemy into our range, he hoped. With this thought in mind, he led his team to the building. To his astonishment, there seemed to be no one there. He cast his gaze around for Charles. When he found him, he saw a long black sword appear in Charles's hand as he swaggered toward the enemy's army. "Is he crazy?" Keenan thought frantically. If he had known that Charles's plan was to confront the enemy openly, he wouldn't have led all his people into the building. But again, his nagging instinct told him to stay put. "He's crazier than an outhouse rat," Keenan thought. "But he's the strongest person I've ever known. He built the Alliance, and although he's many things, he's not stupid or reckless. He never put himself into jeopardy." Keenan took a deep breath and ignored the nervous looks several of his people were shooting in his direction. He calmed his nerves and continued with the plan. All of the military soldiers wondered the same thing. Can Charles really defeat nearly 3,000 people? Judging from what they knew of war, it was obviously impossible. Even if every one of the 3,000 soldiers was an ordinary person, Charles would exhaust his energy just protecting himself from the bullets. Once he was exhausted, even he wouldn't survive long. But Charles knew that statistics didn't win battles, and not every army was created equal. It was true that many members of the enemy army appeared more ruthless than normal people, but he knew that many of them harbored feelings of weakness and inferiority in their bones. As far as he was concerned, it was of little consequence whether the enemy had 3,000 or 10,000 troops if their soldiers were all useless. "Who's that?" A soldier standing guard at the rear of the Stellar Technology Army saw a figure appear in the dark and took aim with his gun. However, the figure disappeared like a ghost. Just as the soldier began to wonder whether he was seeing things, he was attacked from behind. "This is how I'm going to die," the soldier realized. As he lay on the field, he watched as his companions met a similar fate. They fell to the ground without making a sound. In the distance, he saw Charles approach the Stellar Technology Army from behind. Charles sauntered over to a group of soldiers, and his blade moved faster than anything the soldier had ever seen. 7 or 8 of the soldier's colleagues fell to the ground at the same time. Killing 7 or 8 people in one hit wasn't difficult for a paranormal, but what shocked the soldier was the deadly efficiency with which Charles dispatched his targets. The entire process was completed in total silence, ensuring his movements went entirely undetected. The soldier's eyes widened once again when he realized that many of the other soldiers' bodies had disappeared. "He's using a spatial superpower to hide the bodies," he realized. "It's a waste of space, but it's a good idea to destroy the evidence." it was no longer a secret that Charles had multiple superpowers. It was a rarity, but not impossible. Stellar Technology had one dual-powered paranormal in its army, and it even had a triple-power possessor too. However, the soldier had never seen a spatial power utilized in such a way. The wretched man passed away, and it was perhaps lucky that he never knew the true extent of what Charles had been doing, because Charles wasn't only using the energy space to destroy the bodies. During his recovery at the survival base, he had collected many bodies and had put them into the storage space. Among them were many paranormals. He hadn't had time to refine them, so he instead used them for energy as he needed. He had spent a fair amount of time in his energy storage space, and he had wondered in recent days whether it had reached a stage where it was capable of sustaining life. So, while he had been working with the Dawn Alliance, he had also taken the opportunity to put down some soil and lay the foundations for some gardens in the storage space. Then he had taken some wheat seeds and had tried to encourage them to germinate. However, for an unknown reason, whether it was the climate or something else, the seeds had never propagated. Charles had been disappointed, but he had accepted that it wasn't meant to be. He also knew that because the seeds hadn't lost their life force, it meant that the reason they hadn't grown was because they lacked something, or because they hadn't been given enough time. One day, when he had gone to the storage space to replenish his energy using one of his previous enemies, he had discovered that several of the bodies had already decomposed and had lost their energy. He had been disappointed, but then he had noticed something incredible. Some of the land in his energy space where he had planted seeds had germinated. That discovery had filled him with joy. That was when he had realized that although the energy storage space had formed a world of its own, it lacked all kinds of elements that the real world had. When the bodies had decomposed, they had apparently released whatever special elements had been missing in the soil. It had been an important discovery for Charles, although the implications were disturbing. He rationalized to himself that he and his alliance were nearing a crucial moment in their survival, and the enemy soldiers were already dead. He made the decision to leave the bodies in the storage space in order to encourage his crops to grow. However, he told himself that he would only use enemies who had died in battle. Even he drew a line at harming a person just to grow his food. "I've done some bad stuff," he admitted to himself, "but I'm not a psychopath. Death is a natural process. I may as well benefit from that process by using it to sustain life. But I'll only use enemies of the Alliance. Really, it's no different from harvesting core crystals or taking a paranormal's energy." So, Charles had begun his morbid project. Now he swept through the night, moving like water, and everywhere he went, soldiers sank to the ground and disappeared. He took out more than 50 enemies. Finally, one of the other soldiers became aware that a large number of their group had disappeared, and several members of the troop went to investigate the odd occurrence. A paranormal with advanced eyesight saw Charles. "Who are you?" he shouted. "Why are you here?" The soldier had already pulled out a gun. He didn't want to waste his energy because he had already used a considerable amount, and bullets were free. But before he could pull the trigger, Charles suddenly appeared directly in front of him. He didn't have time to react before he found himself on the ground like so many of his fallen comrades. "We sent 2 platoons and 4 paranormals, and they were all killed by the enemy," a Stellar Technology soldier reported to his commander in a panic. The commander was furious. "How many enemies are there?" "1, sir," the messenger said. "Only 1 person?" The commander scoffed. "You mean to tell me that 4 paranormals and 2 platoons of soldiers were killed by a single person?" "The man is too powerful," the soldier insisted. "Even the paranormals are no match for him. He's cutting us down like weeds." "Well, if this guy thinks he's all that and wants to start trouble with us, then let's teach him a lesson," the commander said. "Send 3 level 4 paranormals and 2 close combat paranormals to give him our warmest greetings, and have an elemental take off this snake's head and bring it to me." "Yes, sir." The soldier accepted the order and left. Less than a minute later, the same soldier ran back in a panic. His eyes were filled with fear. "That demon killed 3 paranormals. He cut them down before they could even raise their hands." "Were the 3 of them asleep?" a nearby soldier asked incredulously. "How could they not manage to defeat 1 guy? I thought paranormals were supposed to be powerful." The commander looked at him coldly. "Are you questioning the abilities of the paranormals?" The soldier quickly shrunk back into formation. It was fine for him to insult his subordinates, but no one was allowed to question the abilities of the paranormals. It was also a dangerous thing for him to do, because rousing their anger meant that none of them would be willing to protect him. "Sir, I thought I ought to mention something," said another man hesitantly. We just received information from headquarters. The team we deployed earlier encountered a level 5 paranormal. If he really is level 5, it wouldn't be impossible for him to kill 3 level 4 paranormals if they were unprepared. Fear flashed across the faces of everyone who heard the news. A level 5 was synonymous with power. Even a dozen level 4 paranormals would likely pay a heavy price if they tried to attack a level 5. Before a level 5 paranormal died, he could choose any enemy to accompany him to his death. Consequently, there was only one way to take out a level 5, and that was to use a sneak attack of some kind that would exhaust their vital energy. If you knew that there were level 5 experts among the enemy, why didn't you tell me immediately, you incompetent moron? The commander snarled at the soldier. Faster than anyone could blink, the commander shot the soldier in the head. Then he put his gun away. Pity he was an ordinary person, he said coldly. If he'd been a paranormal, he'd have been able to repel the bullet. A few of the men around him laughed nervously. They stopped short of laughing too loudly, in case they drew the commander's attention to themselves. They were human too, after all. I want platoons 7, 8, and 11 to attack the level 5 paranormal, the commander said. Once the soldiers have tired him out, tell all our paranormals at level 4 and above to attack together. Use all the guns, weapons, and ammo you need to waste this devil's protective energy. Once he's weakened, have our experts attack. Under no circumstances should this enemy escape. He sent messengers to every group they had. The commander was furious that the communication devices still weren't working. He wasn't used to having so little communication on a battlefield. He had fought in many battles, but never one where he had been effectively blind to what was happening elsewhere on the field. But he felt confident that he had arranged enough people to deal with the issue of the lone soldier. Therefore, he was satisfied that he could return his attention to dealing with the members of the Dawn Alliance. He decided a powerful attack was their best hope. Since they had already opened a gap in the gate, it was possible that they could infiltrate the enemy with more people and establish a stronger front line. However, when this plan was put into effect, it didn't seem to work, because the Dawn Alliance's resistance was too strong. The front line was stuck. After a while, the commander began to lose his patience. "What is going on up there?" he demanded. "What are those idiots at the front doing?" He went into a rage and then paced several times to calm himself down. "Patience," he muttered to himself. Then he shouted at the soldiers, "Hurry up and get me a progress report. I want to know why those sloths are taking so long." The soldiers obeyed and scampered away. But before they could send word back, the soldier who was reporting on the situation with Charles returned. "It's bad," he said with a gasp. "Half of our level 4 paranormals are dead, and the remaining ones are refusing to move forward and fight." "Half of them are dead?" the commander thought. His blood ran cold. The thought was like a heavy hammer striking his heart. Every level 4 paranormal at Stellar Technology held a high status. Even though he was the commander, he didn't have the power to order them to their deaths. He also had to acknowledge the fact that after the war, if they sustained significant losses, he was the one who had to assume the responsibility. "How many colleagues does he have?" the commander asked hoarsely. "How many traps did he set?" "It's just him," the messenger replied weakly. The commander felt dizzy. "I sent 4 groups," he thought. It's not possible for one man to kill over a dozen paranormals. They were level 4s. They couldn't all have been useless. "How did he kill more than 10 paranormals?" he asked, looking faint. "How can there be casualties from 4 groups?" The soldier lowered his head. The paranormals thought they could get the guy if they worked together, so they ganged up on him instead of having the ordinary soldiers shoot him first. The casualties of our normal soldiers weren't high. The commander could feel himself losing his temper again, but he caught himself. "Tell them to do whatever it takes," he said. "I don't care by what means or who does it, but I don't want this scum left alive. Tell the troops it's their lives or his." "Yes, sir." The messenger rushed back to the groups attacking Charles and delivered the message. The commander held his head as he wondered whether he ought to feel guilty for effectively sacrificing so many people for the sake of one man. No, he thought firmly. It's not my fault those paranormals are too stupid to follow orders. They could have used any of those soldiers to weaken this devil, but they still wanted to play heroes and take him out on their own. He knew it had been the paranormals' own choice to disobey his orders, but he knew that the higher-ups would never blame the paranormals' deaths on their own stupidity. They would blame it on him, the commander. If he managed to make it off the battlefield alive, he knew he would face the harshest punishment he had ever known.